Hi, I'm Tara M Dakini from Witches Stitches. I'm a textile artist based in North Ayrshire, and I'm here to talk to you today about my project Pockets of Love, which is a project commemorating the women who were accused of witchcraft during the Scottish witch hunts. So there's one thing that you should know before we begin, and that is that I really hate to give talks. So I'm not going to give a talk. I'm actually going to tell stories instead, which is something that I really love to do. So my first story today takes place a very long time ago, 437 years ago, in fact, in 1586. And my story it begins in Glen Clover, which is a wee village in the Cairngorms in Scotland. And it was a very ordinary place then, a small farming community. And in that very ordinary place, there was quite an extraordinary woman, and her name was Tibby Smart. And she was the person that you would go to if your cows or your sheep were sick, or a member of your family was poorly. And she would know just the right herbs to give, or the right prayers to say, or the right charm to put in your pocket. And she was also a very magical woman, and it was said that she could turn into a brook or a badger if she needed to slip away into the night. And she was a very well respected woman in her village. And but one day something quite extraordinary happened, and that was that she lost her pocket. And a guy in the village found her pocket, actually, and well, he was very curious about what Tibby Smart kept in her pockets, and he had a good old rifle through her pocket and a good rummage, and then he told everyone in the village what was in her pocket. And it actually got written down, and it was she kept pickles of wheat bear, which is a kind of barley grain, pieces of coal, great pieces of salt, joint bones, red and green thread, and items of various colours. And yeah, so he told everyone in the village about this, and Tibby Smart soon came to hear about this, and she was furious. She was absolutely livid, and she found that guy, and didn't she curse him? And didn't that guy just drop down dead? Well, the story started and spiraled and spiraled and spiraled until eventually the Laird of Clovet heard the story about how Tibby Smart had cursed this man, and that he'd dropped down dead. And he decided that he was going to put Tibby Smart on trial for witchcraft. So I don't know much about the Laird of Clovet. It was James Ogilvy at the time. I don't know if he was trying to curry favour with King James VI, but certainly Tibby was one of the first people in Scotland to be tried under the 1563 Witchcraft Act. And so it was that in April 1586 she went on trial, and on the 11th of June 1586 she was convicted of witchcraft, and she was burned on the cheek, and so she was branded as a witch, and she was banished from her community. So let's remember today Tibby Smart from the Glen of Clovet in 1586. So my second story today is about another really smart woman who probably lived around the 16th century. In fact, we don't actually know anything about her. We don't know what country she was from, or where she lived, or when she lived. But we do know that she was really smart and clever and inventive and creative. And we know that she had a lot of things that she needed to keep at hand. She was probably a very busy woman. because one day she took a really long piece of ribbon that would tie around her waist, and she made a really simple flat bag that would lie flat against her body, and she sewed the bag onto the ribbon and tied it about her waist and created the first women's tie-on pocket. So this is a pocket from the late Victorian period. So every woman in her household thought this was an amazing idea, and they started making themselves a pocket or a pair of pockets, and soon everyone across Europe and every woman and girl across Europe had a pocket or a pair of pockets, and they were in common usage from the middle of the 16th century, middle of the 17th century until the late 19th century. So these pockets were very simple to make, and they were often very beautifully embroidered, perhaps with the initials of the owner on them. And women would keep their prized special possessions in those pockets, their money, their scissors and tools, love letters, all kinds of different magical items were kept in these pockets, and they actually came to symbolise women's power and sexuality, the pockets. And they stayed in use up until the end of the 19th century, and even a little bit into the 20th century. My friend said she had a tie-on pocket at school, and it was called a lap bag then, and it was for putting all her sewing and embroidery items in for her sewing classes. So my third story today is actually my story. It's a story of how I come to be standing here talking to you about my project Pockets of Love. So this part of my story, it starts in 2016 when I moved to Scotland, and I'm a textile artist and dancer. So as soon as I got here, I started to teach classes in dance and hand embroidery class. But unfortunately, I got really sick really soon after I moved up here, and my world shrank and shrank and shrank very quickly. And I don't know if you've ever had a serious illness or become suddenly disabled, but it's common to try and hold on to something of your old life, and the thing that I desperately held on to was my embroidery class, and it just was so healing to come and sit in circle with women and stitch and talk, and those women were really kind to me and would take me to my hospital appointments and things. So then of course the pandemic came, and well, everything stopped for me. Everything in my life just stopped in this kind of strange space of a reflection. Opened up in lockdown. I wasn't able to go anywhere or see anyone, and I started to reflect on my career as an artist, and I really felt like, you know, I'd never really been paid properly, and I'd always been struggling, and well, why didn't I take this opportunity to retrain as something else? And I decided to train as a psychotherapist. And my friends, I thought this was a marvellous idea and I'd be a great psychotherapist. So I enrolled on a course, and I found myself on the first day of that course. It was all on Zoom in a group of amazing people who are artists and activists and facilitators and mediators, and yeah, it was amazing for about 10 minutes, and then I walked into a wall of disability discrimination from the tutors. So well, to cut a very long story short, I ended up leaving that course. But I'm a resilient and determined woman, and I decided to enroll on another course, and unfortunately the same thing happened. I got on the course and I walked into a wall of disability discrimination from the tutors, and I left that course. But being determined and resourceful, I found another course to enroll on, and again the same thing happened. I walked into a wall of disability discrimination, and at that point I decided to let that whole idea of this other career as a psychotherapist, I just let it go. But one thing that came out of that was an amazing friendship with a brilliant woman called Hannah James, who's a folk musician. She sings with Lady Masery. If you want to look her up, Hannah James. And we developed this wonderful friendship. And when she was on tour in just before Christmas in 2021, she took a little brief sojourn and she appeared on my doorstep for real. She'd only existed in my phone before then, so it was amazing to see her. And she was 2 weeks early actually, so it was quite a surprise to see her. But we had a lovely time together. And one thing that she'd said before she came to visit was she'd asked me if she could interview me for a podcast. And so she was there and in my house, and I said, well, why don't we do that interview now for that podcast while we're both together? And she said the strangest thing to me. I'll never forget it. She said, I've got the money now, we can do that. I was like, well, what do you mean? You've got the money now? What? Just didn't make sense to me that you might wait for the money before you're starting a new project. And she said, yeah, I've got that grant. The grant's come through now, so we can start that project. And this was such an amazing thing to me. I said, what do you mean you've got a grant? And she said, yeah, I've got a grant from the Arts Council. I was like, oh. I said to her, do you think I could get a grant? And she said, of course, Tara, of course you could get a grant. What would you do? If you had the funding, what project would you make? And with that, she disappeared. Well, she went back on tour. And it was just before Christmas 21, and every Christmas I take a Yuletide retreat. So I started my Yuletide retreat with this question swirling and whirling around. If you had the funding, what project would you make? And during the retreat, 3 memories came to me, and the first memory was of a Facebook post, and it was a Facebook post of a map of Scotland, but it wasn't just any map, it was an interactive map that had been developed by the University of Edinburgh, and it was a map of witchcraft in Scotland. And I clicked on the map and I looked at where I lived, and I was astonished to see that there were 6 women who'd been accused of witchcraft in the village that I'd lived. And in all the little towns and villages around where I lived, there were also 6 or 7 women who'd been accused of witchcraft in all of those places. And I was shocked and astonished because I hadn't heard about anything like this. And it's the kind of thing that you think, well, it happened somewhere else, didn't it? But no, it happened here in my village, that 6 women had been accused of witchcraft. And the second memory that came up for me and started swirling and whirling around in the cauldron of my Yuletide retreat was of an exhibition that I'd been to many years ago at the Fashion Museum in Bath. And it was a small exhibition of women's tie-on pockets, and I'd never seen or heard of them before, but I was so enchanted by this little exhibition of women's pockets, and they were so beautifully embroidered, and there were so many stories that were attached to the pockets. There were love letters and accounts and money and tiny magical things. I remember a pair of the most delicate kid gloves that were rolled up so small that they fitted into a walnut shell, and the walnut shell was kept in the pockets. And that memory whirled and swirled around in the cauldron of my Yuletide retreat. And the third memory that came to me was about 10 or 12 years ago. I took part in a project called Roses from the Heart by Christina Henry, who is an Australian artist. And she'd set out to commemorate all the women convicts who were deported to Australia and Tasmania from the UK and Ireland. And she'd done this by having a bonnet made, a cotton bonnet made for each woman who was deported. And that was about 26,000 bonnets she'd had made, and each bonnet had the name of the woman on it and the name of the maker embroidered on it. And it was just an amazing project to have been part of. So by the end of my Yuletide retreat and the start of 2022, these memories had whirled and swirled around, and they'd become this idea to make a commemorative pocket for each of the women who were accused of witchcraft during the Scottish witchcraft trials. And I was determined to apply for a grant to get funding for this project. And I applied. I was going to apply for as many grants as it took, but in fact it only took 2 applications, and I got a VACMA grant, which is funded by Creative Scotland and your local council. And it was a small grant for 4 days of research into my project. And I started out by listening to all 60 Witches of Scotland podcasts. It was an incredible resource and an incredible education on the accused witches of Scotland and beyond. And I also started to think about how to connect with the women, because there are so few artefacts, historical artifacts of the women and their lives, and the things that remain really are the writings of the men that accused and tortured and convicted the women of witchcraft, and the metal objects that survive, which are the instruments of torture that were used upon them. So very often if you go to an exhibition about witchcraft or the witch hunts, it really focuses in on the torture instruments and the narrative of the men that accused and convicted the women of witchcraft. And it made me think about how, I'm not an historian, and I'm an artist, and actually as an artist I have the power to and the liberty to create new artifacts. And I became my passion for the project was renewed, and I decided to apply for a much bigger grant from Creative Scotland's Open Fund, and after a lot of time and effort I got that grant. And so I'll be researching and developing my project until the end of 2023. And if you would like to follow my research, you're welcome to join me on Facebook. I have a group called Witches Stitches, so you can follow my research and development of my project on there. And come 2024, I'll be looking for volunteers to take part in the community aspect of the project, to come together and make pockets to commemorate the women who were accused of witchcraft in Scotland, with the view that those pockets will eventually be displayed in local museums around Scotland. So again, if you want to take part in the project, you can join my Facebook group, Witches Stitches. And one last thing is that I'm actually looking for a project assistant. So if you like to drive and you like to visit museums and you want to help, if you're interested in that role, then you can find me on my Facebook group, Witches Stitches. And I'm Tara M Dakini, and my project is Witches Stitches Pockets of Love. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me today.